been all my days in every city. You know it's high. Don't forget what you got. Looking back, looking back, looking back, looking back, looking back. You know it's high. Don't forget what you got. Looking back,
That's
looking
gonna
back, looking back, looking back. You know it's
I check.
high.
I don't. I thought maybe.
You know it's
Yeah. Mic check
high.
1 2. Can you guys hear me?
Looking back, looking back,
Welcome
looking
in, everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We're gonna get started shortly in a second.
back now.
Play the beautiful sounds of Miss Lauren Hill in the meantime.
Looking back and looking back, looking back, looking back, looking back, looking back.
How you gonna? Mic
Looking
check 1
back,
2.
looking
Mic check
back,
1 2.
back.
Welcome in, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome in.
He's about to give us a dissertation.
Welcome in. Can people see?
Go ahead. Break it down. Break it down.
All right. We're about to get started here in 1 minute. Let's see where you guys are all calling in from. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves and say where you're calling in from in the chat so we can just see. Jackie. He's doing this. Sorry to the tight. We've got one microphone today, so one band, one sound. We're gonna be sharing. But I think it'll be okay. Okay, fabulous. Yeah, right. Notes here. Mm. All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. My name is Cheryl Kapong, and good morning to the folks in the room. I won't just be talking to the laptop, and I'm sure that there'll be some other folks joining us shortly. But good morning, everybody from New York City, New York Climate Week. My name is Cheryl Kapong. I am a senior project manager here with the Chisholm Legacy Project, she, her pronouns, from Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm just so excited to be here with you all today. And yes, sorry, I'm like wanting to give us a welcome to Cultivating the Conditions for Black Liberation and Just Transition, Advancing Transformative Climate Finance. We've got a really exciting panel and conversation slated for us here today. And yeah, I wanted to give us a chance for each of the panelists to introduce yourselves briefly, your name, your organization, and where you're coming from. And we'll start with who's in the room with us here. So, Jackie.
I'm Dr. Thompson. This is Legacy Project coming from the Scholarly Territory in Maryland. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Most of you with Natural Resource Defense Council, also coming from Maryland.
Nice.
Well, from New Orleans, but living there.
Okay.
Outside, that side.
And those of us online, our panelists.
I can go. My name is Dr. Isaac Takola, and I am coming from Akima Atom Lands, also known as Phoenix, Arizona. And I'm with Eco Sankofa Farm.
Hi, good morning. My name is Delicia Reynolds Hand, and I am with Gilmore Condor, who is supporting this work. Happy to be here this morning.
Thank you so much. And just a quick note to our panelists, people are having a little bit of trouble hearing you. So please speak up and yes, keep us accountable if at any time we need to slow down or speak up. Please let us know in the chat and we will do so because we want to make sure that everybody everywhere can hear us all. So yeah, just a quick grounding as to who the Chisholm Legacy Project is for those who don't know. We are a resource hub that serves frontline communities. I like to call us a manifestation organization, right? So when we're thinking about what a brave new world looks like, at the crux of Black liberation, just transition, and gender justice rooted in environmental justice. What does that look like? How are we honoring the knowledge of those on the front lines and frontline communities? How are we reaching out to help pull up those who have historically been ignored by the systems that be? And yeah, so we have a bunch of things that we do in that regard. But today we are specifically here to talk about transformative climate finance through a Black liberation lens. And so I just want us to go ahead and get started, respecting everyone's time. I know we have a lot to get through. So if we could hand it over to Jackie real quick to give us a grounding of the reason why we're here today, the paper that's being released, and what it is that we're talking about. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, good. Yes, so it's so good to see some great names, familiar names and new names in the chat coming through. And it's an honor to be here with you all today, and especially to release this paper that has been, there's so much heart, soul, and brilliance has been poured into it. So when Trump told the UN, "You're all going to hell," the good news is that we can only go up from there. I thought I thought that we had reached rock bottom when he called our nations blank hole countries, but he really managed to beat that with addressing the United Nations. So we also know that out of the top 15 nations that are most impacted by climate change, that are facing the greatest degree of climate forced migration, 8 of them are Afro-descendant nations. We know that across the world, that genocides are being proliferated, and that the U.S. is really at the root of and definitely aiding and abetting some of the worst genocides across the country, across the world now and historically. We know that people are being driven from their lands and seeking refuge in our land, and they're being caged or disappeared or treated in the worst imaginable ways. And yet we have this notion of the United States as this superpower, as this world power, and the ways that power has been yielded have been destructive, to say the least. Yet, as we draw hope from the fact that there was a recent study that showed what we already know, that Afro-descendant stewardship of the land, and we all know also indigenous stewardship of the land, is the way that land does best under our leadership and our stewardship. And we've seen that from the work of, and hopefully Dr. Yishak will talk more about the work that she does in Phoenix with the land. Groups like Earthseed Permaculture, in both, there's actually Earthseed both in Durham and an Earthseed in California. We know the work of Soul Fire Farm and Leah Penniman and so forth, and so many places where that is proven time and time again. So with the ways that we are with the land, the ways that we are with each other, even the 7 principles of the Nguzo Saba that are rooted in African culture, cooperative work, collective work and responsibility, purpose, faith, all of these, creativity, all of these are manifested in our culture. So if we're only resourced for self-determination, if we're only resourced to ensure that we have sovereignty, if we're only left alone and not oppressed, then not only can we have thriving communities for ourselves, but we can also link arms with our comrades across racialized people and beyond to see liberation for the world. We all know the principle of Ubuntu, I am because you are. So on my way here, I took like a 45-minute walk to get here, and I almost fell at least 6 times. It rained, or tripping on my boot because I broke my toe on Monday. And I would say that it is definitely representative of what it's going to take for us to keep going. Like, I think it also represents that what kept me up was not only my own just kind of managing to stay upright, but also whatever spirit and power is behind us being resilient folks and us being able to kind of keep going and doing what we need to do to advance the goal. And my goal was getting here. Cyril, and then I'm getting off the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you for that grounding, and thank you for getting here safely. Please walk safely back to your seats. Yes, thank you so much for that grounding. I'm actually going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Isak, and let's make sure, did I pronounce that right? Dr. Isak, like E. Period. Okay. So yes, to give us a grounding in the paper, specifically through your view, how you feel current U.S. climate finance structures uphold racial capitalism. It's a big one, but you know.
Yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, in writing this paper, it was a challenging time because we actually had to restart it quite a few times because of the pivots, right? Initially, we were talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, and we were talking about the Security and Exchange Commissions, which was calling on the stocks to start to actually track emissions. And it seemed like we were moving in the right way. And so back then, given a critical analysis, we were still critiquing, but we were examining these steps, these policies that look like they were moving in the right direction, right? This is like end of 23, 24. But then, boy, what pivots, right? As soon as the Security and Exchange came out, initially we were arguing for tertiary life cycle emissions. So we're not just talking about the direct emissions from things that we're consuming, but the emissions, for example, if we're consuming something in the United States, but it was made in China or it was mined in Congo, we're looking at all of those emissions. So this is what we were arguing for. They went from that to getting sued to not including any emissions at all, right? Initially, we were arguing that the Inflation Reduction Act should have more funding for marginalized communities, and then they took the whole thing away. And so now we're in quite a different space that we were even when we started talking about this work, because what was possible, what we were asking for has shifted. And so that's also how we shifted the paper, because we said we would like to stop kind of in some ways letting the right shape the conversation, because if we were to just talk about defense, right, the right continues to shape the conversation, because now we're just defending the things that we weren't even happy with in the first place. And so now you have us defending the status quo because you took it away. And so that also shifted this paper, and that's why, and we were like, okay, well, you're writing your project 2025. Well, it's time for us to write, project 2029. And so we started looking at, instead of looking at, so oftentimes we look at what's politically feasible. And what's politically feasible when we are in a fascist community culture currently, then what does that do? It allows us to only dream up of the nightmare that we're in. And that is not where we want to operate in. And so as we wrote this paper, we're like, we're going to push past, we're going to talk about reparations when you're saying we can't even say Black, and we're going to say Black reparations. And so we really looked at what was needed, not what was politically feasible in this climate, because what is feasible in this climate has been an acceleration of the status quo, which is genocide, right? And so we're not trying to promote or perpetuate or even negotiate with that, right? We want to set our own terms, and that's what we did in this paper. And so we call out, huge financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. We called for global reparations. We called for an end to the colonial predation that these Western economies do on our communities. And so, I'm excited to delve into this paper with y'all. And I think really, as we look into this, as we delve in, we'll see really, we finally stopped not naming one of the biggest, the largest both emissions and financial costs is the military. And that's something when you look in the climate movement, when you look in the environmental movement, we're not talking about the military. No one's saying defund the military. No one's saying that we cannot continue to bomb the world with no consequence. And so we decided that that's where we had to go, where we needed to talk about, because at the same time, when we call for, we need money for climate impacts, for climate adaptation and mitigation, they're like, we don't have it, we don't have it. Okay, well, where's the money? It's in the military. And the military is what's causing the emissions. And so we decided to go there, calling for, defunding the military. That's where our reparations are, right? So instead of bombing us, you could actually help build us up. And that's what we're calling for in this paper. So I'm excited to get in with y'all. I'd love to also give some space for Delicia to touch on it as well. Enjoyed writing this together, and I think that it's important that, like I said, with this paper, we decided to push past the status quo and really start to define the conditions for not just our own survival, but what truly what would cause the conditions for liberation.
Yes. Wow. What a bold statement to make in this political climate, but a necessary one all the same. Calling a thing what it is, no longer begging for scraps, and recognizing that the money is there. I'll ask Delicia a question really quick and then come to you. With all of the things that Dr. Isaac said, what insights from the paper feel the most urgent for movement and policymakers in the US right now to grapple with?
Sure. Thank you. So, I mean, building on what Dr. Isaac said, I think one of the things that we centered on is that current systems are functioning as designed, right? So I think we all need to sit with that and, as they said, name it, right? And so the paper reveals and really centers on this is not system failure, right? The system is functioning as designed, particularly when it comes to the resources and the needs and the health of Afro-descendant communities. So the same financial architecture that destroyed Black Wall Street in Tulsa now controls climate finance flows, right? And so some of the solutions have really been perpetuating rather than dismantling and challenging extractive relationships and structures. So this is why prerequisites matter, right? We need to move from problem identification. So I think that's another kind of frame issue into solutions, right? Identifying, well, what is that vision that we all can connect around? And then, like, what are the very specific and concrete things that need to be in place in order to facilitate movement towards that vision, right? So there's been so much conversation around Project 2025, right? But that took time, that took specificity, that took data, that took specific targets, timelines, naming the things, and then specifically laying out that very specific path towards deconstruction. So then bringing a different frame, right? Which is, what does that path to construction look like? What is the Project 2029 strategic timeline? And what are those blueprints that we can start to lay out that we can start developing now? So I think for me, that was also a key insight of the paper, which is we're all good at problem identification. Now we need to align around problem solving together in a way that also thinks about a different system, right? I think in these moments of destruction, there's room for us to think about the rebuild, and the rebuild starts now.
Thank you. And so I know you wanted to mention something, but I did want to ask you a quick question, Khalil, about when we're talking about that rebuilding, when we're talking about changing, when we're talking about divesting, what shifts would it take for the U.S. climate finance to materially repair historical harm rather than reinforce inequities?
That's not a small question. Thank you all again, and good morning. And again, thank you to Jackie for inviting me to this space, because I don't very often get the opportunity to speak, especially not publicly, in these kind of safe zones where I can build people up there. So I really appreciate the chance to be here.
They can't hear you that well.
Okay, I'll try to speak louder. So first, I wanted to say really quickly about the IRA programs and what we saw from the very early implementation of those programs. The majority of the clean energy, the EV and the battery development financing that we saw go out from IRA very early on was really targeted to zip codes that didn't even support the legislation. It was, a lot of that stuff went to communities in red states, in Republican districts. It was the sort of natural flow, quote unquote, natural flow of climate financing, of clean energy financing, that really prioritized certain communities, certain spaces, infrastructures over others that our communities just did not have. We were not ready, not set up to bring in those dollars, whereas other spaces were. It was also a feature of who owns the contracting and the development firms that those resources went to, and what communities they were comfortable in working in. And then by contrast, what you saw in a lot of Black communities, particularly spaces where I'm from in South Louisiana, was you saw an explosion in carbon capture permitting requests. You saw an explosion in LNG requests. And so what we saw was our communities were essentially told that we had to limit our vision of what this transition would look like, that we were not going to get the clean energy investments, at least not first, not priority, that we were not going to get, jobs in, battery and tech development and these kind of things. That the best thing that we could hope for was carbon capture to store the carbon, not the pollution, from the heavy industries that were continuing to overburden our communities. And so that's what the early implementation, from the IRA programs were. And those resources, those tax credits, at least for now, are really still in place. The money that was pulled back was the money that frontline communities fought for, drug for, to get from the Biden administration, to help them to figure out how to actually clean up some of these resources. But that money was clawed back. The tax credits, at least for now, are still there, and these projects are continuing to persist in our communities. And so, to the next question, just about what will it take? Finance operates in a framework, in a vision of progress and economic development, right? And so again, as we saw through the IRA program, our communities were basically told, we had to limit our ambitions on what progress and development would look like, right? That carbon capture was pretty much all you could expect, from this process, right? And so, and this has not changed. We are between now a rock and a hard place between, this fascist Trump regime, the rock, and the hard place being this abundance build movement. And let me tell you, neither side cares about us. So, whatever moral argument that we thought we could make to these people, they do not care. They don't care about slavery. They don't care about Jim Crow. They don't care about redlining. They don't care about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. They don't care about any of it, right? Because we, to them, are a barrier to them making the center and right coalition to be able to move policy, to be able to do, what it is that they want to do. We are a complication, to that political process. And so changing that narrative, changing that structure, means us having, this type of alternative vision, for what our life, for what our reality can and should be. But it also requires us to really, spend more time, invest more resources in thinking about what are the institutional democratic structures that will be required to enable us to see it through. Because right now we are a political hostage to a two-party system that doesn't give us space, that doesn't allow us to participate in serious policy dialogues. Having good policy frameworks, having, good policy drafts, ideas. Let me tell you, because I am the spook sitting by the door in these conversations. And so when we draft policy, whether it was the Environmental Justice Act, whether it was the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, In Washington, D.C., those policies are referred to messaging bills, referred to as messaging bills. What that means is they're not taken seriously. They're not meant to go through committee. They're certainly not meant to be voted on, by either chamber of the Congress. Those bills are meant to keep us interested in the process, to keep us going through the motions, to keep us, having meetings and discussions, to keep us at the table, right? But they're never seriously meant to be considered in Congress. If you think about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, there was a lot of pressure at the time because we were still in the midst of post-George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, so there was a lot of action at that time. So there was pressure on them to vote on something. But the Congressional Black Caucus is not allowed to pass legislation. The Congressional Black Caucus is not allowed to sponsor legislation that is taken seriously in Congress. So Joe Manchin had to rewrite it. He had to rewrite it because it had to come from a white senator. It could not come from the Congressional Black Caucus. So he rewrote that bill, changed it, rewrote it, and that's the one that went up for a vote, not the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because again, we are not allowed within this two-party system to actually set policy. And so until we think about how we can transform this democracy to be an actual multi-party, multi-ethnic democracy, we're going to continue to be locked out of these serious policy conversations. And these good ideas, these good frameworks, these good visions are going to stay as messaging bills, on the floor, just to sort of keep us active and interested in these conversations.
Wow, you named a lot of things. You said a lot of things. So I have a question, and this is to, I think, perhaps Dr. Isaac. So when we're thinking about reimagining what things look like, when we're thinking about moving outside of this two-party system that has always been designed, that is functioning exactly how it's supposed to, that is not going to exact any change, that is a lot of ceremonial power and not anything that we can actually tangibly take home to our communities. What role should accountability mechanisms play in guaranteeing that resources flow where they're most needed? Like, how do we then create something new that says, okay, this community that needs this thing, they actually get it. And this community that needs this thing, they actually get it. Because one thing that they try to say about Black people when we get resources is that we don't know how to give them to our own, you know what I'm saying? They tell us we don't know how to do this and we don't know how to do that. So can you speak a little bit to that, Dr. Isaac?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's interesting because they always like to tell us that we don't know how to manage our money, right? And they say this to Black countries, they say this to Black cities, they say this to Black communities, right? And people. So, but then we look at, for example, in the nonprofit sphere, and we look at how much money is given to Black communities and Black nonprofits, right? And it's almost nothing. And the money that we do get often isn't in trust-based philanthropy, right? It's in write all these reports and prove to us that you're worthy, and then we're going to continue to look over your shoulder and make sure that you are, spending every dollar exactly how we want you to. And in the same way that they police Black nonprofits, they police Black countries, right? And so we see internationally structural adjustment loans, right? So the IMF and the World Bank, they will say, here's a loan, right? And this just happened in my family's country in Ethiopia, where they received, they were in a bad place in debt and needing help to get out of it, right? And the World Bank gave this loan and they made it seem like, oh, we're going to help you, but it's never helpful, right? Because the structural adjustment loans come in and they restructure the economy. And the first things they always cut are social welfare programs, right? They cut the education, they cut the healthcare. And so they keep the communities poor, they keep the communities sick, and they keep the communities uneducated. And then they say, oh, now we've built up your economy. In addition to that, they oftentimes do things like, for example, what just happened recently in the case of Ethiopia, right? They actually make them devalue their currency so that they can play in the game next to the United States, right? Devalue your currency so you can bow down to the US dollar. And so, and when we see countries and people try to do something differently, right? So we see Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso, right? And we see what's happening across West Africa, where countries are saying, actually, we're not going to let these white countries continue to steal our resources. Actually, we're going to nationalize these resources to ourselves. Instead of you telling me how to run my economy, I'm going to take the resources in my own country and make sure the profits go to the people. What happens? They get called terrorists. They get called, they actually said Ibrahim was stealing the gold from his own country. And so anytime we decide to take care, and we see in the United States, right? Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Anytime we start to take care of our own economies, what do? They come in and destroy it, right? We can see that in MOVE in Philadelphia, right? Black communities create autonomous communities, autonomous economies, and what do? They come in and destroy it. And so that's the importance and why we put these political prerequisites. When we wrote these 5 political prerequisites, because we're like, anytime that doesn't happen, until we see these things change, any country, any Black community who attempts to, have autonomy, who attempts to have independence, who attempts to create, conditions for liberation, we see that we are the ones who become attacked. And so that's why we put the prerequisites, and we said, we need to change this financial system. We need to change the US global control, the Western global control. We need to create community control finance. And so in these political prerequisites, even we talk about knowledge systems, right? Because our knowledge systems are constantly and continuously devalued. And so oftentimes they'll give us a loan, they'll give us a grant, and they say, oh, you have to play by the beat of our drum. And your drum, your knowledge, your systems aren't valid, right? We've seen this even with the Inflation Reduction Act, the Community Change Grant, which is the largest environmental justice funding ever, right? But then they're like, oh, but you have to fulfill all of these things, which grassroots communities don't have. So now they're locked out of access. Now they have to find a white fiscal sponsor, kiss the ring over here, make sure you listen to what they say over here. Again, we don't have control over it. And so that's the importance and why we started with the political prerequisites, because until we change these conditions, we're going to keep begging. We're going to keep not having control over our own finances and resources.
Political prerequisites. When we put the QR code up for paper, y'all make sure you control F that one and take that to your organizations. Hello? So Delicia, when we're thinking about, the Black Wall Streets and all of the different times that our communities have done things to try to become sovereign, to try to be able to have our money move in our communities, and then they snuff us out, and then they're killing us, and then they're making sure that these things are not reaching a certain scale. How do we seed and scale these models in ways that resist institutional backlash while staying true to principles of self-determination and liberation?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that is important that we see happening right now is so on the one hand, you can look at this moment and see in the United States, right, what happens when institutional systems are dismantled and there's no respect for constitutional norms, right? And at the same time, there is a backstop. We have a constitution, right, that the current administration keeps coming up against, and we have something that we can hold up as a measure of accountability and an articulation, a lot of times debatable, right, of shared values and norms, right? So I think we have to start there. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we have some infrastructure around which we can organize, right? So maybe we can tether to constitutional protections. That is a universally recognized mechanism. And so we can sort of seed and scale first by resisting the backlash, by tethering to both national, so US federal constitutional principles, but frankly, also international principles, right? We are starting to see, for example, some of these actions now be challenged at the international level, as much as we want to kind of, in the US anyway, get away and pretend that globalism hasn't always been the operating norm that has driven extractive capitalism. It is, right? And so where we have constitutional protections, be they via the US Constitution or recognize international treaties and standards, I think that's a way that we can create a backstop and then really center back to community control of resources. I think the other thing that kind of comes to mind that we talk a little bit about in the paper is the fact that so we have this US federal system. At the same time, you're really seeing states, local communities say, yeah, not in my backyard, right? Not in my state. We are different. We have different norms, and this is what we want to fight for. So in my mind, that creates a real pathway for us to really center in on how we start to seed uh, concrete steps towards resistance and building that future. The Western Healthcare Alliance, for example, I think is a really powerful in the moment example where, we are dismantling any fact-based system and data-driven system in this country, and yet a coalition of states has said, no, we care about the health of our communities and our children. We believe in science. So guess what? We don't need the CDC or the FDA. We're divesting from and we're creating our own. So we are seeing models that really center on community control and and so alliances can be broken apart. They can also be built, right? And I think we're seeing that in real time. And for me, just of late, the Healthcare Alliance, that's really pushing back around this anti-vax corporatist moment, right? Because it's not just about health, it's about redirecting profits elsewhere. Because if you look, everybody in the administration has some, interest in the shift away from that kind of technology. The other thing I would think about and introduce in terms of thinking about seed and scale is because at the end of the day, in order for our communities to be productive, they have to be safe, right? And so I think safety is something that is also necessary, right? Until we actually transform and start to seed that vision that we want, right? We are in the current system. We operate under US and international climate finance system. And so we also have to think about kind of moving these kind of community controlled mechanisms. And at the same time, as Dr. Isak just spoke to, right, we see active retaliation, right, as the examples that she gave in Burkina Faso. So not that I necessarily have an answer, but I feel like it's like, yes, let's build our own things, but let's not also repeat history, right? Which is every time we start to gather resources, move in a true community controlled way, the system comes crushing down. So we can't ignore the safety aspect, and we need to just think about how we address the reality of moving out of a system that's crumbling, beneath our feet, right? And ensuring that our communities are safe as well.
Yeah, safety is a huge thing that's entrenched. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to add to that as well. I think, there's two parts to that. I think, the first in thinking about how to create some accountability, through finance. I think, and this is speaking first specifically to the US context, right? Is, communities thinking about, what are the existing levers of finance that they can actually access and control, and that's usually through public dollars, right?
Okay.
And so thinking about, how and what are the mechanisms that we can have greater say, greater input, greater control over the allocation of public resources through mechanisms like participatory budgeting at the local level, right? And so, because once you do that, particularly for, communities that have been disinvested for so long, that don't have a whole lot of capital resources, but for communities that don't have a whole lot of capital resources, having access and control over public dollars is a way that they can begin to democratize development. And it gives them some leverage and say over, what type of, compounding investment actually comes into their community, first controlling those existing public dollars. And then, in thinking about accountability, a lot of times, with these, like, community benefits agreements and things like that, because, private capital is private capital. That's their money that they're going to try to come in and, invest in things that they think that they can extract value from. And so first, we need to have standards for people who want to invest in our community, who want to partner with our community on investments, not just come in a type of extractive formula, thinking about what they can get out of it. And so, we want standards, for, what they will invest in. We want standards for local value capture from those investments. So, what benefits actually come to us. And, part of that too is, too often, we focus community benefits on, the sort of construction phase of the project. We don't think about the full life cycle and how much wealth and income is actually generated from that project over its lifetime. And, the community benefit doesn't typically cover all of that. And so we need to be thinking not only short term, but also long term in terms of what those accountability, what those standards of that investment actually look like when it's coming in, to our communities. And then, one other thing, we also, we need to think about, what are and have a very clear vision and agenda for what the economic alternatives are. Because, when global South countries were going through decolonization, so first, the whole concept of economic development as a field was created so that colonial countries could manage their colonial territories. It was about setting up these colonial countries through a system of extraction to feed the colonial country that was dominating. That's where the field of economic development came from. Schumpeter and all these people came from that. And as these nations begin to seek independence, you had local development economists, begin to create different models, import substitution strategies, for example, that said, why are we importing, feeding these people raw materials and then importing, finished products back to us? We're just bleeding money out to these colonial countries. That's what can we build and create locally? What can we add value to locally? That's still happening to this day. Just last week or 2 weeks ago now, at the African Climate Forum in Addis, the African Union finally decided to create a continental coalition on critical minerals, for African nations, so they can try to begin to repatriate some of that wealth from critical minerals, so that they can try to refine and process those minerals locally instead of just shipping it raw, out to Western countries. And so, those strategies, were important. Many Western economists, Western, government ministers, trade ministers don't like those ideas, because it doesn't just bend to their will. But most importantly, and then going back to the U.S. conversation, we've seen similar strategies because at one point we were having very close dialogue between African American folks here in the U.S. with our, diaspora, families on the continent, in the Caribbean and South America. We were very much involved in a global dialogue that has really deadened, in, the last generation, and we need to recapture those relationships. But if you think about, like, the history of people like Harold Washington in Chicago, he had an economic development framework where he was trying to keep local industries in Chicago, to base what he called a jobs-based economic development program in the city of Chicago. And there was resistance, there was pushback, particularly from the financial sector, because they weren't interested in investing in industry and jobs. They wanted to invest in real estate. And real estate won, right? So Harold Washington was trying to, and so, he was trying to take these old warehouses in Chicago and reopen them as local small manufacturing. He was going to use public dollars to be able to do this and trying to get investment support to do that. But finance said, no, those places will be better as condos, right? As real estate investments, because what financialization is really about is about abstracting finance, is abstracting the economy from the material world. It's abstracting it from our actual lived lives and experiences, and what we need, and actually, in order to have a good quality of life. And so it's how can we continue to grow our wealth, without having to face, any consequences from the environment, from social factors. And so that's why, finance, has poured more and more money into real estate, because once you build a house, once you build the apartment, once you build a building, that stuff can appreciate in value perpetually, without having to do anything. And so it's a perpetual growth engine, without having to, running up against any sort of physical limits. And those types of investments, they don't produce jobs, they don't produce livelihoods, and they don't produce shared wealth, through those types of investments.
Thank you. Lucy, you have to go here in a second, so I want to give this question to you. What are the political and cultural shifts required to cultivate the conditions for Black liberation through climate finance?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot. We laid out, I think, 5 specific shifts that need to happen first. One is we can't keep denying or ignoring history, right? As we've all been discussing in this conversation, it sets a tone, it has built the system, it very much shapes the way the law is constructed. So from a political and cultural perspective, we need actual and meaningful historical responsibility and reparative justice, right? You can't just acknowledge, but you actually have to repair. We also need to shift from a Western norm of what meaningful knowledge and contributions are, right? If you're not at the table, you're on the menu for dinner, or whatever the saying is, right? And so, our ways of tending to our communities, our land, managing and stewarding our resources, are often not in these important convenings to the extent that we are, right? We have a lesser and secondary position, and that really just reflects a kind of cultural norm of seeing Afro-descendant cultures, systems, as lesser than, not legitimate, right? It's not our reports and our research that gets lifted up. We then don't get the grants or the resources that are directed to our communities, so on and so forth. So actually seeing things that have worked, frankly, for hundreds, thousands of years. The irony is like there's actually more history, right, and demonstrated proof of ways of managing and stewarding our own resources. As we've been saying here, there is no getting past this current moment without a radical transformation of the U.S. Governance and hegemony. Is that how you say the word? Right. But, its position in the global order, right? Interestingly, and probably by its own hand, right? That is shifting before us, right? So that may facilitate a pathway, right? But you can't build a just future, right, with an unjust system. And certainly with the U.S. Capitalist mode of governance that has really, you know, driven all of these different international climate finance forums and structures. That goes to the role of the US in international climate finance architecture. That also has to change. And then I think going back to Khalil's point, right, we need actual movement building, but we can't do it on our own. And I know we talked a bit about movement building um, in the paper, but you know, those conversations, those cross-border collaborations and movements that are starting to take shape, right? We need those more than ever. I think in this country, we actually can't move out of these challenges on our own. And so I'd say we need a set of defensive actions now. And then, you know, we can work towards system replacement. But we can't replace the system by looking in a very insular US based way. We need to build bridges again or strengthen those bridges with communities in the Caribbean, Latin America, et cetera.
Thank you. I didn't know if Dr. Isak, you wanted to add to that. And also, real quick, I just want to say questions, put them in the chat. We're going to get to the questions portion soon, but yeah, put your questions in the chat. But Dr. Isak, to what Delisi was saying with building those kind of cross-national movements, and even to what Khalil's point was, there was a moment where our movements were very interlocked. There was a lot of like the folks, you know, who came and helped Asada were from Cuba. Like we were talking, we were connecting, we were organizing. Granted, they killed a lot of our leaders, recognizing the fact that we're on Zoom and we all have Apple products, so you know, but they did. And so how can movements across the regions, US, Caribbean, continent, beyond, collaborate to build financial systems rooted in solidarity rather than extraction? How are we gonna get those things back up and running in this surveillance last time? Sorry for my guessing.
No, thank you. I think yeah, I think this is a great question. I think one, we have to realize the silver lining to where we're at, right? The silver lining is kind of how Jackie had opened up, right? Well, you know, our so-called president just told all the nations to go to hell. So we're at pretty much the bottom of where we could be at, right? And so like let's just hope this is the bottom. And you know, what happens when we have, you know, an authoritarian fascist in leadership is that, you know, the United States starts to lose its legitimacy. And in some ways, that's also a political prerequisite, right? Because the United States has had so much liberty and continues to. But I think that when, you know, you have someone who, one, is starting to attack comedians for making fun of him, and you have this, it starts to, yeah, again, chip at the credibility of the United States, which is needed when you have, for example, right, in order for us to, the United States and the ways in which they have been the global policemen or global terrorists, if you will, we have to have them to stop, right? And so there's already conversations where the United States military has been like talking about Ibrahim, has been talking about Burkina Faso, has been talking about coming over there, and you know, we haven't even talking about Palestine yet, right? And we know the United States is responsible for that genocide, right? Those are our tax dollars dropping those bombs. And so when we look at like what can we do, right? Being in the belly of the beast, this is exactly why it's so important to have strong international movement, strong Pan-African, Afro-diaspora movements. And I really feel when you look at the way we've moved, one, it's a function of American privilege. We got to talk about it, right? First world privilege, us sitting here, and all of the benefits that we get with that blue passport, right? And so it allows us to move in certain ways. But I also think it's a function of I'll say it COINTELPRO. I think the ways that we have been split up from our communities, and the ways that we now see, I think that the United States wants us, Black and African people, to fight each other, to argue who's Black enough, and all of these other conversations we're seeing happening online, right? And seeing our communities fracture, right? This is the work of the state, because when we cut off our siblings, right, our indigenous siblings in the motherland, where are we supposed to go as the sink ships, right? And as the ship sinks. And so it's really important that we have, and we can look to our ancestors, we can look to the Panthers, that after they attempted, and in some ways did, hold the United States accountable for white supremacy, hold the United States accountable for the ways they terrorized Black communities, where did they go? Many of them, right, had to flee. And that is, again, why it's so important that we have backup plans, right? That we have these connections to communities. We also see, for example, right, the United States continues to fund Israel's genocide against Palestine, right? And what we're happening right now, right? There's a global flotilla, and Israel's already called them Hamas, and which is basically, you know, gives them room to kill them without say, right? But we seen Spain and Italy sent Navy ships and said, you cannot continue to kill humanitarian workers. And that is what we've seen. We've seen South Africa was one of the first countries that held Israel accountable, right? And so when this is the importance of international solidarity, right? Because when our country, like it is right now, wilding out, who's going to stop us? It's going to take other countries. It's going to take our, you know, our cousins, our diaspora communities to now hold us accountable, to put the United States back in its place, to give us the sanctions we deserve, you know, for the ways that we are harming the international communities. And so I think that's what it takes, and that's the importance of Pan-Africanism, that's the importance of international solidarity, because the position we're in, right, our hands are tied. There's not so much that we can do from within the belly of the beast when we don't even have free speech anymore, right? But that's the importance of international solidarity, where you know, our global community can help hold our countries accountable and can help start to shape and shift the international dialogue.
Thank you. And before I let you say something, I want to ask you a question as well that I would like for you to answer. You know, as our community spook to the left, when we're thinking about all of the things that Dr. Isaac said, when we're thinking about the fact that the things that are detailed in this paper call for a replacement, honestly, something new, something different. And we see what's happened historically to our communities when we try to do that. We talked about how we keep ourselves safe. How do we prepare for and withstand pushback from entrenched financial and political interests that benefit the current system? How do we set ourselves up to protect ourselves?
I'll answer the last part really quickly, and then hopefully I'll come back to it again. But, you know, how do we protect ourselves? First and foremost, it is by uniting and building with allies. And that's, you know, here domestically, but, you know, as well as our, you know, relations, you know, throughout the world. And, you know, we are under the mood at the moment of a political movement that has convinced people that selfishness, you know, is a winning strategy, right? That, you know, that convince people that freedom means not having to care about anybody else. But that also means that, you know, your government doesn't have to care about you. Your corporation doesn't have to care how much they pay you or how much they politically committed. And so, you know, we need to push back on that with the politics of solidarity. And so I think, you know, how we defend ourselves first and foremost is through solidarity and being consistent, you know, with that, and being genuine with that in both directions. And to the other point, this is a really good segue. It's turned out pretty good. You know, how we, you know, build these movements, you know, across regions. And I'm speaking specifically to African Americans at this point, you know, because, you know, at one point, you know, we did have, again, you know, very robust dialogues. You know, we were concerned about, you know, the politics of Africa and you know, the Caribbean, you know, et cetera. You know, but once colonialism, at least in the formal sense, fell, once apartheid fell, you know, and we didn't have the white enemy to point to, African Americans kind of lost interest. To be clear, because we could not put the politics of Africa into that race frame that we are so used to thinking of the world through, because it's so much of what our lived reality is, and we weren't able to step outside of that box. So we don't understand, or we're afraid to comment on, what is the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea about? It's not about race. We're not involved in the conflict in Congo. It's not about race, at least not, in, formal sense. We don't we're not talking about Sudan. We're not, and so we're not engaged really in the politics of Africa. We're not engaged in the politics of Haiti. Unless it's about race, right? And so we need to expand, our thinking, and how we engage our sisters and brothers, how we engage the politics of the continent, particularly, from, issues around development rights, climate justice, I think is a huge piece of that, which is bringing us back into that conversation. And so, I think we have to take advantage of those opportunities. We have to take advantage of the international spaces that do exist, even if, they don't, fully speak to or enable, the types of responses to these questions that we would like. We need to be there, to prove the contradiction, right? But also to take advantage of those spaces, to give us an opportunity to be able to come together. Like, we know New York Climate Week ain't about us. But we can use this as an opportunity to create spaces for us to have these types of dialogues to come together, right? So, we have to, to continue to do that. And then to go back again to the last point about, how do we do this? I think, again, we are in, a very tough moment, here for us. And, one of my friends, who's from Liberia, he was saying, he's like, because, he, grew up under conflict situations in Liberia, went through 2 civil wars in Liberia. And, he's just saying, you Americans, you have no idea how bad this can get, right? Because, you still think that, this can be solved just by the next election. You still think this can be solved just by the midterms. Whatever we were doing before, something needs to change. We need to shift our priorities, because, what we're facing right now, if this is allowed to continue to consolidate itself, we have no idea, how bad this can really get. And, we have more power today to fight this than we will tomorrow, than we will next week, next month, next year. If this is continued to allow to progress, without building, the type of response that we need. The very last thing I'll say is, again, we talked about it earlier, other folks talked about it, go back into our history. I am a child of the Black Panther Party. And so, for me, the Black Panther survival programs, they were, the burgeoning of an alternative community development. But they were not, and this is very, very important, they were not an escapism from the system. They still knew where they were. They still knew what they had to influence. They still knew what they were fighting against. But they said, we need to do this in order to create a buffer, a space for us to build, for us to think, for us to survive, for us to imagine, so that we can continue the struggle, because this system is not feeding us, like literally and figuratively, the nutrients that we need to be able to continue to struggle. And so, today we call that solidarity economies, different things like that. And so, there are ways, big and small, for us to continue to think, to plan, to operate, in that way. I think, in a big picture sense, again, we talked about, African nations creating this critical minerals coalition. Why aren't we thinking about how we can work with those nations, around the development, of those minerals, processing it there locally, being involved in the supply chain with them. Why aren't we at the table talking with them about that? So those are like, some of those big questions, that we can answer. So there are big and small ways that we can begin to rethink and reimagine, what a just economy looks like. We have, again, the tools, the assets, the resources, within our respective communities to begin to be able to do that, and to really put pressure, on these systems that, would tell us otherwise.
Thank you. Again, questions in the chat, you all can ask them. Also, questions in the room, be thinking about them. We'll come to that in a moment. Me and Jackie were talking about yesterday how someone on Second Avenue, that brings us to our next point, was holding a sign that said, US, please don't give money to African warlords. They are trying to kill me. And so that reflects a genuine and real dilemma, right? How do we ensure that US climate and repertory finances flow without enabling harmful regimes? Especially given the US's own record of imperialism and its lack of credibility to judge others. Like, how do we confront that tension? How do we talk about those things that are happening amongst and in our own communities? And maybe I'll ask you, Dr. Isaac, because Ethiopia.
Yeah, I think it's really important to kind of measure when we get involved, for example. Because it has additional impacts that we don't even think about. For example, I'll talk about like the queer movement across Africa, right? And so it's, queerness is not new. It's something that's always existed, right? And it wasn't something that was demonized either until colonial Christianity. And so what you have now is white evangelical missionaries going over to African countries, demonizing gay people, and causing them to fear gay people like it's some sort of contagion. And now you're starting to see this rash of laws that make being gay out loud illegal, right?
Right.
This is a legacy coming from the United States, right? Is a reality coming from these colonial entities, and otherwise. And yet, when this first started happening, I wouldn't say first started, but yet we've seen under Obama and then under Biden, these sanctions put on African countries like Uganda for their anti-gay measures. And then on the other side of that is the conversation that other queer Africans have to deal with, because it's like, oh, the United States came in to save you guys, which perpetuates this belief that being gay is a Western concept, which it's not, right? And so then it makes them feel like, oh, this is being pushed down on us by the West. And then when that happens, there's further retaliation that the people and the country does against the intended marginalized community. And so we have to look at ways that, the United States and the vehicle that it is and the imperialist machine that it is. And we have to be very careful when we ask the United States to intervene, right? Because when you have such a colonial imperialist machine and you ask it to come over, right? It's like a bull in a china shop. It's going to kill a lot of people unintendedly. So it's right. You don't want to bring it over to try to support when you know that there's going to be unintended consequences. And so I think that there is a lot that can be done, ways that, we can follow the leadership of the people on the ground. But I also think that it's really important when the United States does get involved that we be careful about what we're asking it to do. Be careful, because I remember, and I'm going to forget the name, but I think this is in 2012, there was some movement we learned about, a group of people that was terrorizing a community. And then it became this kind of social media virality of like, oh, we have to do something. We have to show up, United States show up. And later on, we found out that, it was kind of, there's a Western impetus to get us to freak out so that we would tell them to show up. And turns out there was minerals there. So I was like, did we just perpetuate imperialism? And
Yeah.
so it's really important that we think critically about how we want the US to be involved, or if even they're the right vehicle, and maybe they're, even if there's other bodies, other like the UN, for example, that might be better because of the legacy that the West and because of the legacy that United States has.
Yeah, definitely. Just really quick, we've got about 14, 13, math is not my thing, 13 minutes left. So I want to quickly do two things. Number one, keep asking for questions. Does anybody in the room have any questions that they would like to ask either one of our panelists? You can make a comment. You can make a reflection. I ask that everybody keeps their things to under 90 seconds because we do want to close ourselves out and respect our time. And we rented this place, so we got to get out of here. But yes, if you have something to say.
So it's only 9 seconds, like you can finish here and you talk, please.
You have to come up here.
Okay. So, thank you very much. Thank you. My name is Mithika Wenda. I'm from Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Let me see here. Okay.
Yeah. Can you?
Right.
Yeah. If the cord will reach, so the people online can see you.
Yeah. So I have just some comments. I'm very sorry I came late because of traffic jam. I'm staying quite a bit far from this place, and the New York the traffic jam is terrible. I just got you when you were discussing very important points about the solidarity movement and how we should strengthen ourselves. And I was just reflecting when you were talking about that and asking myself, why has the right wing movement been so strong and overthrown the us who are progressive? Because listening to Trump speaking during the in front of the world leaders, you don't think that this is really an American president whom we should respect. But that is the law the United States has got. And actually, that is indictment of the US itself with its citizens. So that's how we take it from the African point of view. Really, it's terrible. He is anti-everything. He is anti-climate. In fact, he sees climate as hot. It doesn't really, that's an insult to the people who are suffering in the African continent and vulnerable people all over the world. And, he is anti-immigration, he is anti-LGBTQ, he is everything, anything progressive. That is now where America is. And that's the face of the American citizens. He can only align with Netanyahu, So he is very happy with seeing dead bodies in Gaza. That is Trump. He doesn't care. And the empathy which we used to see in the US is no longer there. But that is where we are. And coming now then to the solidarity movement, and what we need to do is we have always overcome that. We have overcome slavery. We have overcome apartheid. We have overcome colonialism and all those, but this is done through solidarity. So North-South, we cannot do it as Africans, nor can we do it as the Afro-descendant movement. We need to ask you, somebody has said, we need to build bridges.
Yeah.
How then do we need to do that? We need really mobilization.
Right.
And that is actually why with the progressives and the so-called left, not the extreme left, the radical left, the way Trump said, because in fact, he want to declare, I think he want to sign an executive order that maybe even the Black Lives Matter will be declared
Radical, terrorist movement.
Well, the guy is saying, and no one seems to stop him. I was really surprised that those guys, heads of state, would just sit there and be lectured rather than walking out on him the way they did to Netanyahu.
So they are emboldening the guy and he doesn't care. So, but you know, Trump is an antithesis of what has been building over years since the right-wing movement lost power in 1945. You know Hitler, represented by Trump, you know, in those years, and Mussolini and Lenin and those others, they were purists and they didn't believe in any other race. And so when they lost, you know, they realized they had lost and they went into the drawing board. Whereas we, the right wing movement, the left wing and progressive went to relent. And you know, they captured all our institutions. I have always said, all foundations, those organizations which used really to stand by people, where are they now? They have been captured. You know, they will be interested in $5,000 which they are going to give you in the paperwork rather than the work which you are doing. So you waste a lot of time. I'm not saying accountability is bad, but that is where we are. But let me move out of that. So moving forward then, what we need to do is, and that's what we have been doing under the this our collaborative effort.
Yeah.
The Afro Descendants
Well, for the second.
Climate Justice Collaborative.
Yeah.
We need really to strengthen ourselves.
Yeah.
And I've always insisted that unless we organize ourselves,
Yeah.
no one will come to organize us. I respect Jackie so much because I know there are, you know, foremost women who have really inspired change and brought young people like this so that we can grow the movement. Before I came, I was meeting some other Black people, and I was convincing them that this kind of fragmentation, this kind of way of working.
Mm-hmm.
So because I was asking, have you been invited to this meeting I'm going? They were just telling me they are not aware of it. It's very sad.
Mm.
So we need to try to see how we can reach out to others.
Yeah.
I think we want to really to make impact. The right way lose,
Yeah.
we need to disorganize us.
Yeah.
And we need the only solution we have is really to organize ourselves, generate that critical mass. Critical mass will really prevail, and we are going to overthrow these guys. I'm not talking about you know, overthrow. It's people power. Yeah. I saw people power in Malawi just the other day. Where people mobilize themselves, young people, you know, they have a lot of power. So I just wanted to end by saying that you have mentioned a very good point on the African minerals, critical minerals coalition. And actually, we are behind that. And that just transition is really interesting now, is gaining traction in Africa and elsewhere in the world. Though Trump doesn't believe in renewables or critical or anything, you know, he will be left behind. I want to give the story of Kodak, the Kodak camera. Yeah. You know, when the discovery of the mobile phone came, and this new technology, those guys just were stuck in their old Kodak, the old camera. Yeah. You know what happened? They were overtaken by events and brushed off. That is what is going to happen with the Trump and people. It is. So don't bother him. So because the world is so much moving, in the next couple of years, you'll never find the internal combustion engine cars on the road. It is not that we are going to remove it. It is going to be removed by technology because it's cheaper. Electricals are cheaper and they make sense. But what drives that is 90% of those minerals, cobalt, lithium, copper, all of them, magnesium, all those, they come from Africa. Okay. Are we really, if we are the ones who are powering that energy, renewables, you know, these electric vehicles, the wind power, solar power panels, and all those, are we benefiting? So that one, I think the point that we need to bring this this coalition to the Black community investors in the world. Yeah. I think that is something which we can pursue. That one, it builds power, even economic power. Yeah. If they be able to drive that, but we can create that connection because we have conversation. Right now, the discussion which we have is the roadmap for the implementation of the Addis Ababa creation. Yeah. Yeah. We are the ones, actually, we are the ones who have been advised to develop now that roadmap and action plan. So bringing elements like those ones, and that kind of the Black community investment is something which we can discuss, and this can be done in our countdown as we move. Part of the roadmap is really moving to the COP30. So we are ready to discuss that, and let us touch base. Let's see how this will work in practice.
Thank you. Thank you. This is Mythica. This is a little plug. We host secretariats for the Global Afro-Descendant Climate Justice Collaborative to connect environmental justice activists across the diaspora with the hope of building movements and momentum towards our shared liberation. And we would also like to become the recognized constituency at the UN level. So you're right, we will become, you're right. We're on our way to becoming the 10th constituency at the UN level. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Mythica has said a lot of incredible and amazing things. I'm specifically talking about even your mention of the Council on Minerals, on of the things that we all have. How can we build that collective power with each other? Another way that we can also build a lot of our financial sovereignty is through that. So these are all things, and I appreciate that. I know we only have 3 minutes, and I wanted to ask you guys both for something. I know we also have some stuff in the chat really quick that I want to draw attention to. Evita Sawyer said, I agree that we have to braid our knowledge systems, Western epistemologies, thank you, want isolation in knowledge. It desires the feeling of being the best way, but non-Eurocentric communities know the beauty in sharing our practices and we're putting them in conversation. We know that the United States has a paternal colonial model, so they think they can just tell everyone what to do. Anyway, Jamia, shout out to Jamia. Hey, that's my girl. Agreed that organizing via Afro-descendants is key, while also believing that cross-cultural values organizing is key, acknowledging that the Afro-descendant is cross-cultural, but believe working with non-Black folks and value alone folks is key. Yes, we do need to build our movements. We need them white people to come up and put their bodies on the front line and help us, honestly. So if y'all know any of people like that, slide them our way. Hey, we have one in the room. Shout out to you. I really want to, we literally have 30 seconds. I want to respect our time. Like I said, we have to get out of here so we don't get charged. But I want both you, and I know you had something to say, so I'm hoping you can just wrap it in there, Khalil. Sure. And Dr. Isaac, I want you both to name one transformative demand that US-based movements should unite around to advance Black liberation and just transition. One. And let's make it cute. Dr. Isaac, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I guess I would ask for, I think the main way, when there's damage, we can look at what happened with South Africa and apartheid, right? And so they had truth and reconciliation. But if you look in South Africa today, you see that white people still own the majority of land and wealth. And why did that happen? Because they had reconciliation without what? Reparations. And so that is what was missing, and that is what is needed. And so what I would call for is reparations. And when we call for reparations, we're calling for climate reparations. We're calling for that with a lens of looking at one, right? Addressing within the United States, reparations for Black people for building this country and now being most impacted by climate change. And then globally, we're talking about reparations as a consequence for colonialism, and now also looking at the fact that these two things are connected, right? So through colonialism, you get the industrialization of Western countries, and then now you get the fact that the global South is more vulnerable, and now we're in a situation where least responsible is most impacted. And so how did we get there? It was through colonialism. And so how are we going to fix that? Through reparations. And of course, whenever we call for reparations, most of the time they're like, why are we responsible for things that happened a long time ago, right? But when we look at the fact that through colonialism, you have industrialization, you have the rise in CO2, and it's that rise in CO2 that is now displacing our communities. This isn't something that happened a long time ago. This is something that is continuously happening. It is Katrina, it is the fires, it is all of these natural disasters, which are the consequence of colonialism. So these two things are not disconnected. They are intricately connected. And so the solution has to look at both of them. And when they say they don't have money, we remind them the United States has the largest military 25 times over. All the money's right there.
Right there.
Wow. So was the one thing I would say, we are in a revived era of strong men who want to be strong men. So, I would say, we have to be, consistent in the demand domestically, and also in the way that, our nation interacts and responds and builds with other nations around this issue around democracy. Because we have a lot of leaders in this world who, their sort of governing philosophy is, the powerful, will do what they want, and the poor will suffer what they must. And so, that's really the guiding principle. And, it doesn't matter, whether or not, it's coming from Trump, Putin, or, any other leaders around the world. If we're not holding them accountable to the types of democratic values, we talk about inclusion, we talk about community empowerment, we're talking about, letting the voices of the most impacted be heard. We say all of these different phrases to keep us from just saying democracy, and to keep us from really engaging and thinking about, what are the forms, levers, structures of governance that are necessary to enable us to enact the type of policies to build the type of future that we want. And we need leaders to be held accountable, to be held responsible, to making sure that they are enacting those values and not just telling us. I keep thinking about there's this old video, you can look at it online, of Fred Hampton Sr., Chairman Fred, and he's talking about Jomo Kenyatta. And it's like, we don't know if Jomo Kenyatta is going to be a revolutionary or not. We have to see how this progresses. But a key aspect of that is how he or any leader interacts with and really empowers and listens to their people, and puts democratic structures in place to allow that to happen. And the very last thing I'll say, because we talked about at the top, Trump, telling all the nations that they're going to hell. Just remember, every accusation is a confession. And what he's doing, what others are trying to do is to take their nations straight to hell, and we should not walk with them down that path. And so, let's create our own path and walk together. Thank you.
Viewers, for letting us steal 4 minutes of your time. I feel so enriched by this conversation. Anytime I hear Dr. Isaac speak, I'll be like, hey, you said it all. I appreciate you, Khalil. That was incredible. And to Delicia, who had to leave us early, we thank her as well. You can get access to the paper. Can we share that in the chat, please? The link to the paper, and there's also a QR code for the paper as well. Please read it. Please share it with your networks. We will send it out to all of our networks so that you guys can all have access to it. It's really, really important. This is laying it out very explicitly, what needs to happen, what needs to occur. They always tell us, how can we make a new system? Here's how. Look at it. Read it. Soak it in. Take it to your organizations. Take it to people who are asking what the mechanisms look like. That's exactly what this is for. These conversations are not ending. This is definitely a part 1, 2, 3, 4. Lots will be talking about this more in community and with others. We thank you all so much. If you have any questions or you need anything, please reach out to us. And with that, have a beautiful rest of your Thursday. Have a beautiful rest of your Thursday. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, guys.
There's refreshments for those in the room.
How much time do we really have?
We have to leave at 12.
That's all.
Which means that we have to yeah. Actually, I don't think I have access to do that. Okay. Auntie